affects or deals with that directly. So.
Yeah, I don't. It's not any particular field or anything like that,
Yeah.
that I would bring to it. But I'm always interested in taming complexity and of course, human systems that are highly dynamic.
Gotcha. Okay. I can approach it from that direction, no problem. Hey, Alfred. If you want to put stuff in the chat or contribute, I know you're low bandwidth, so just however you want to. You have questions. Jeremy I asked Jeremy what level or direction he's interested in, and he said he's interested in taming complexity and dealing with human systems. So I thought I might address that real quickly and then maybe see where the conversation goes from there. You cool, Jeremy? Is that all right? Does that sound good? I'm not hearing anything.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, cool. All right. Sorry. I see a little thumb up there in the corner, so forgive me if I'm not catching the cues in this interface just right. Okay, so in terms of taming complexity, we understand that humans have a certain amount of behavior similarities, right? We may not be able to predict exactly what somebody's going to eat, but you're pretty sure by and large somebody's going to eat. A few times a day they're going to eat something, and that something they eat was then a fairly finite range of all the things they could possibly eat, to foods we can digest. So there's still a very small sliver of the overall reality that we're actually dealing with. Similarly, when humans interact, granted, we've got a lot of systems on blockchain. My most recent dive into blockchains has been on the Cardano chain. And as you can imagine, that ledger is growing rapidly and has to be copied everywhere. So that's a huge inefficiency in a system. It's also very centralizing. And Cardano's tried to, it fits into a fundamental paradigm of finance and everything being equated to a dollar. So if you want to involve humans into that system, you need to break humans into some dollar amount, which is antithetical to human existence. Human beings have no regard or interest in what the denomination of some currency is. It's not essential to our being. So in terms of taming chaos, we need to redefine what chaos really means. In terms of human endeavors, and particularly in disaster, we could say it's somewhat chaotic behavior, but again, we're in a very finite limitation of behavioral possibilities. And as I looked at this issue of providing support in the disaster moment, it became pretty obvious that being able to provide for the necessities of somebody in a disaster moment would be even more capable of handling necessities in real life outside of that disaster moment. And that then I started thinking about what things are in common between all of our situations. And that is, at any given moment, there's something that we need and something that we have to offer, whatever that may be. And in terms of building a system for dealing with people, to me, it seemed kind of useless to try and create categories or definitions of any kind at all, because that is precisely the kind of thing that we're trying to get people to provide. We need information that we can make intelligence out of, and the more context available, the better. So if everybody's communicating in the way that they normally do, then they would provide all that information through use of the system, as opposed to the typical programming approach, which is very xenophobic, patriarchal, colonialist, and in that it's inadvertent, but I think people are raised in Western culture to feel very proud of what they are and actually not think very much about other places. So the idea that other people have a categorization process of their own, it sort of doesn't occur. Even projects that are trying to do good, like Sahana Foundation, for instance, they were funded by IBM and are still very much involved, but they have a great deal of categorization preloaded, and that fits really well into the United Nations Harvard Humanitarian School, Kennedy Center, Kennedy School, excuse me, paradigm, which is that the kind of the savior mode. NGOs will show up out of the blue and take care of everything, which is not only unsustainable, but it's proven to be really ineffectual. And then now being dependent upon groups like the USAID, which could be disbanded with a stroke of a pen. Now there's a very large layer of humanitarian NGOs that were getting funded by this one agency. So, we hear this one agency is getting axed and think, oh, great, everything else is working. But that's really not the case. This agency was filling everybody's coffers. So now that that's dried up, the entire humanitarian agency world is freaking out. Thousands of people are getting fired, missions getting dropped, thousands of people are being hurt, injured, starving to death, not available for this aid that does come up. So it sort of perpetuates this desperation feeling also, that when the savior is not available, then we'll never get the help we need, which is putting some kind of crisis energy into my desire to get this project moving as quickly as possible. I would like to rewind really quick. And I want to first, let me stop for a second, Jeremy. Is what I'm saying makes sense in terms of harnessing chaos? It's like, it just depends on what we call chaos, and harnessing is really more like guardrails rather than trying to control behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
okay.
Makes total sense.
Cool. Okay, so a major part of what has needs, that's the name of the project, a major part of its function and what it's about is to create tertiary effects. I'm trying to create the conditions that pro-social outcomes will occur. I'm trying to create a mentality that will be more benevolent and prolong that time period post-disaster where people are giving of themselves regardless of their history. They suddenly come forward and help each other. We see that over and over. It's a very well documented and studied phenomena. So the reason I got on such a bend, and the reason I've been so kind of neck deep in this thing for the past 15 years is because of a very unique situation back in 2010 with the Haiti earthquake. There were Tufts students in Haiti, very closely connected through email and then other means afterwards to their professors and whatnot, and rest of staff and colleagues at Tufts, and there erupted a series of hackathons. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that part of the event, but a lot of people came to bear really quickly. OpenStreetMap, a whole bunch of volunteer groups popped up. I was part of this other organization called the Standby Task Force. And what that situation presented me with, just by sticking around there and having time and interest, a great deal. I had previous interest, and I could talk about that at some point too. But basically, I was able to be in a room with people that I never, ever would have been around before, or could have conceived of being, actually, from DARPA, major universities, Google, the whole range of people from the higher echelon of Boston's tech scene was in these rooms. And I witnessed people who were professionals and experts and had been doing this for a lot of years, basically just dismissing out of hand the fact that a very high percentage of the Haitian population had cell phones. And it seemed so obvious to invite people to send reports and to help send updates, because the main conversation in all of these meetings and the hackathons was, how are we going to get more data? That was their main goal. There's a hunger for actionable, georeferenced, accurate data, but nobody's willing to talk to the people who actually are the data that was being sought. So to me, that was heartbreaking. There was a number of little initiatives that popped up, to try and help people connect with stuff like that. But I never lost this feeling that we need to find a way to have people involved. And obviously, I asked a lot of questions at the time about why, wouldn't we implement this really obvious solution, as I thought. And I discovered really quickly that from the very, very top to the very, very bottom of the entire NGO industry, everybody is trained to never listen to human beings, which, again, through my own history, I have a lot of background and reason for why I think that's super important, not the least of which is trauma. You in order to help someone through a traumatic experience, they need agency. And if you're only donating aid and you're providing a colonialist mindset, then that agency will never be there. And we see that happening. Certain populations have been kept for one reason or another. They've been kept as victims. in that victim state. So I knew eventually that crypto would come along and provide a means by which we could prove that somebody is unique and identifiably unique. And then I knew that after that, and that zero trust was on its way and proofs were coming. And instead of get caught up in how to program it, I went to UMass Boston and got degrees in psychology and sociology so I could understand trauma and indigenous studies and how communities deal with trauma and the best way to architect something based on satisfying the needs of providing disaster relief to an individual based on what they want. So I had these kind of tenets starting to formulate back in 2010, 11, and 12. And I kind of hit really that first day, it was immediate that we had to deal with things of what people have and what they need. And that just elegantly broke out into all the other ramifications of what happens when you have individual sovereignty. And the best part of that for the disaster case is that you don't actually know who's going to survive any particular disaster. So if you want to have a resilient system, then you need to arm everybody, basically. And then from there, the questions were, how do I have somebody who is able to be their own database, basically? And I felt that there should be a mechanism for a group of people to validate one another within a system where everybody is their own blockchain. And pretty soon I had an inverted blockchain, which was basically the ledgers 100% distributed. And I didn't have a database solution quite yet. There's a couple other things popping up, including a locative reward tool, kind of a thing on Cardano. It's some interesting things about, how to deal with location safely in a blockchain environment. I looked at Holochain, which has a flaw for me, for my purpose, in that every app has to expose its IP address to every other participant, which is good for them, but bad for privacy. So as a sovereign being, I figured that they needed to have their location permanently and always hidden and obscured, and also the actual wallet ID, because if that's compromised, then that's a vulnerability too. So I figured I needed to have an abstraction layer. And to that, I use this thing called a persona manager, a black box for now. But what it would be is like NAT for your own blockchain, and then you'd create any number of personas, and that's how you'd interact with other people. So it would only be persona manager to persona manager via these different aliases, so to speak. And that only that device could write to your own chain. And then I figured that instead of dealing with other types of environments that I've seen before, like barter networks back in the 1990s, that was a big deal in California. These electronic barter networks where, everybody was kind of euphoric about it, but it still dealt with currency and valuating things in terms of dollars, and then trying to create some form of token or local currency just inherits all the same flaws. So I figured that for optimal health in a system that was going to create more health, that the best method would be to ensure that the very atomic structure of your interaction involved reciprocal energies somehow, and that would trickle out through local mentality and spread through the culture of a system, that what we do here is exchange. I'm not taking, you're not, there's no one way dead end road process. And that becomes especially relevant when we're dealing with personal information. In a disaster, you have, well, not everybody, obviously, but a very, very typical response and situation to be in a catastrophic situation that you're still alive, is that you're isolated, and often, without anything more than the clothes on your back. And if you can find a way to empower somebody in that moment, then I feel like you've really got something that can be useful and that would be utilized. And if that same system carries them from that moment on the way through the rest of their recovery and beyond, then you've got something that would be really valuable to people. And when you imagine somebody naked and alone under a collapsed building, and we recall that in those Haiti hackathon offices, there were rooms full of people who all made more than $200,000 a year, who were screaming about not having enough data and spending millions of dollars a year trying to gather and collate data. And here's this one individual. So what my goal became was, how do I let them know that this person exists, and how does his data get to be monetized directly rather than dealing with all these intermediaries. And I figured, in conjunction with survivability, that the only thing that was possible was to allow some sovereign individual to leak out particular bits of information that are important to them and incredibly valuable to them. And I knew that the need for control and ownership of the data that currently was, well, still is being exhibited by NGOs, I knew that we'd reach this threshold moment where their need for pristine data would override their need to own the data. And I feel like we've passed this moment already. And I'm sure that through other conversations I've had with project managers in the UN, country managers for the UN, GIS managers in a number of different levels of agencies, they all say the exact same thing. Their biggest challenge and their headache all day long is, how do I get actionable, updated, accurate, fresh, geolocated data? So I know I've got an incredible resource if I can harness this thing around an individual person. And then the question comes, how do I let people interact with each other? And then I came back to this has and needs objects that get passed around until they hook up to each other. And as I got more into Cardano, I discovered about the extended UTXO model and how an NFT can match that in the context of a smart contract. And so I figured that the perfect needs, an unanswered need, is exactly an eUTXO. Perfect. A thing that can satisfy that, and with or without a smart contract, is an NFT. Perfect, because an NFT can be represented by an image, a chunk of voice, like a voicemail message, or some other triplet or object that we have in data that can be represented through the NFT. So we now have a mechanism that's really clean and connected to what that object's purpose is. And that, to me, was kind of another tenet. I wanted to have every single piece of this, and I'd wait for the technology to come along, but I wanted every piece to be kind of purpose-built. And I was struggling with whether I'd have to build my own blockchain and database infrastructure, which I was avoiding, obviously, because I'm not, really a programmer as such. And obviously, around 22, 23, along comes LLMs and generative technologies that I've been enjoying a lot. I actually left my job at a consumer product company called Blink. They make security cameras. And I dove in full time, just getting excited about the technology, the creative capacity, testing all the models out, trying to break models. I got some work at Outlier, breaking models and trying to write, better prompts and stuff. And it was interesting and cool. But I, in the course of vibe coding, had a conversation, a few of them, trying to figure out, and I had a lot of rough starts on how to approach has needs and how to make it code out and what tools to use. So I got a lot of philosophical conversations about how tools work together with the AI. I was really encouraged, though, because every single conversation I'd start with, have you seen anything like this? Am I missing anything? Is there any flaws here? And 201, once they all went through an aha moment. They tried to approach me with the typical, yeah, well, there's marketplaces and information. But once they actually got how this thing works, they're like, holy shit. I've literally got, a couple of these screenshots where the AI is going, holy shit. And it just goes on from there. The ramifications bleed out really quickly and interestingly. And I, could probably write a book about it at some point. I hope to. At any rate, the conversation that really pulled things together was a result of a guy that I met a few years ago named Derek Cabrera. And his big thing, he's now at Columbia teaching, and his big thing is about contextualizing information and how to make a knowledge bit exist. And he came up with this 4-part structure that every piece of knowledge should have these 4 chunks together. So I asked the AI, so what do you think about, how does this filter into what we're trying to do? How can we incorporate some of these ideas? And it just went bang-o. Okay, so I'm going to briefly say what that transition was right there and then get into the design and what the thing is actually that I'm talking about. But what it came up with is that it basically formulated a data triplet that allows me to use 3 different systems together for mutual benefit in a way that I was struggling with how to fit all these technologies together. So the technologies are DXOS. I'll put some links up. It's I can do that in a second. But DXOS, and then NextGraph, which is just fairly recently become ready for prime time, and that's really the key nugget of what I was waiting for. And then another technology that's been around for a while. It's really critical to the project, but it's sort of on its own. But again, this data triplet just wraps it all together. But that is called overlays capture architecture, which is a way that you can create hierarchical shells around data or metadata information. So it was sort of the actually one of my first pieces of, I saw it and I said, oh, this is in my toolkit for sure. Whatever else is going on, OCA has to be there, because it allows granular control. And one big thing that I care about a lot is being able to protect and contain indigenous wisdom in a way that's useful for the community, that can still be useful in parts to outside agencies, but whose provenance and ownership is always respected. And I can't trust people to respect each other like that, especially the dominating industries and agencies that we're dealing with right now. So rather than trust them to protect me, I'm creating, again, a sovereign shell around every being. And if we look at it in terms of moving parts, we've got the has and the need, they kind of go together, obviously, and the sovereign being, yes. And then the only missing part from there is the fact that sovereign beings gather together in groups. And the act of gathering together is what they do. And I think a lot of other projects get caught up in what kind of gathering, what's the name of it, how many people, is this a body of some kind? And what I got back to is that it doesn't really matter to me a whole lot. People gather, and they gather for their own reasons, and they gather and disband for a million different reasons, and they gather in some and stay, and lots of different things happen. So my feeling was that to make this project as simple as possible, that I should use just one single architecture for the community component, and that the communities only exist because sovereign beings are consensus to be in that community. So that any place where more than one person joins into, it becomes a community, as in the system's parlance, and in terms of how much I care about it, so to speak. I've been involved in a lot of different things that involve disaster. As a paramedic, I've been in the military, and I've been part of small and larger teams and small and very large incidents, including the 300-car pilot. So I know how triage occurs. I know how people gather, how humans gather and disband to achieve something. So if we have individuals who are running and writing to their own sovereign blockchain for themselves, the receipt actually is what it is, right? A receipt of all these interactions, that they should be able to gather together for a small group, define a purpose, achieve that purpose, and then disband and then go do something else while still being part of other groups and communities. So I didn't want to put any limitations on how communities expressed or how individuals use it, any more than I want to put limitations on what somebody considers what they have to offer or what they need from the world. And a really important part of recovery from trauma, and especially disaster trauma and crisis, is that it doesn't really matter what you need. It just matters that you understand that you can express that need and then have a chance of having it fulfilled. And nobody's to say, nobody's to say what it takes for you to heal, So if something is required in someone's life and someone else thinks it's ridiculous, that relationship should never be allowed to occur. The judgment, the prejudgment, the response to isn't part of the project. It doesn't matter to actual human interaction. So all of my has and needs are being matched anonymously. There's no, attachment. Now, of course, if you have like a regional problem, Tutsi Hutu type of a thing, they're living very close by. You don't want to get a leather jacket from somebody who's going to show up and kill you, obviously. So, and this isn't hyperbole. I mean, it's a real concern that actually happens in the world. So to protect that, you obviously have some ability to filter things out that you don't want to be considered matches, and you can vet the other chain when there are matches presented to you. But the point of all of this is that protecting sovereign identity protects you in a lot of different ways, and I maintain that throughout the entire structure. And it also, because of that, creates a mentality of protection and sovereign interaction, which ties into the idea that every single interaction is a value exchange, including just data about what color shirt you want. That's still data that someone else will pay for. And if they're going to pay a middleman, then they ought to pay you directly. And that direct payment is the value exchange. And you can't have the transaction without a value exchange, because value exchange is the only thing that's written to either chain. That making sense so far?
It is. I'm scrawling in my notebook like mad here. I was typing for a minute, but I had to switch to a notepad to keep up. This is good stuff.
Well, then I'll back up. So when you've got a value exchange on each chain, my method is to make an identical copy on each chain. Therefore, those two chains are linked by that thing only because they have it. So truth in my system is only a thing that two people have an identical copy of, and they each say, because it's identical, yep, that's true. And I'm saying, yep, that's true. And we have that tacit agreement now. Because we both wanted something, we both got something, regardless of what it was. That fact exists. Even the whole thing's encrypted. No one else can see it. But it's still a thing that we both attest to, and it can be traversed by an agent to say, yep, that's identical. So therefore, these two events did occur. Now, in an ecosystem, imagine a forest of individual chains. I, as a squirrel, should be able to say, here I am, I'm going to hop to the exact same spot over on this chain, and yep, that's identical. Now I can pick a random entry, hop over to that chain, yep, that's identical. And as many times as I hop, I'm proving that the whole system is still valid. And if everybody's doing that all the time, then you have a sufficient number of random interactions to ensure that the whole thing is identical. Since this black box, the persona manager is, well, it's not a black box anymore, but since the persona manager is what's the only device that should be writing anything, then if anything doesn't match up, then it's been compromised, and we can assume it was from some sort of deliberate effort. You know, if the chain's missing, that's different. If something's altered to be not identical, then something's wrong with that chain. We don't know where, we don't know how, we don't know why. And something's wrong with the chain that led to it, because that exchange is out of whack. And we don't care, we don't know, it doesn't matter, because the system only deals in truth. So anything that's outside of that has to be shoved aside in order for the rest of the system to be working just fine. And so instead of dealing with it in a fiat sort of a way, punish that person and delete the account or whatever, we're humans, right? So I have to gray list it. And what that does is it creates a distrust from that point backwards through time, because we don't know when or where or how. We just know something wasn't right, and until it's resolved, then the whole thing, we're just going to shove it over on this other mode. That creates a social interaction. If you're interacting with somebody and they've got a series of exchanges and everything's just fine, and then all of a sudden they come across you and your trustable chain is only 3 transactions long, you're going to end up having some sort of a reason to describe what's going on, to explain what happened, because people would want to be able to trust. And then the system is so trustful that if you're not, you're really an aberration. So I'm trying to use human behavior to help modify the desire to cause any discrepancy or alter it in any way. And, you know, people are stupid. Maybe someone tried to hack it. Kids, who knows what? I mean, there's lots of things could happen. So you need an opportunity to, A, reverse the exchange, in which case you'd create an equal and opposite value exchange to undo the whole thing. But that leaves an audit trail, right? So then you get to see that somebody's unreliable on their chain. And that's something you could also filter out for in terms of people you don't want to interact with. If they choose not to, or they can't, or the other party refuses, or whatever happens, then obviously subsequent behavior would now be trustable, because that's all part of the healthy part of the ecosystem. But what you do with that series of exchanges is up to you. So if you did something bad or wrong, quote unquote, or antisocial in a way, some way to potentially redeem yourself and be seen as more valuable and be trusted quicker would be to interact with organizations that do really good things, or that have more social standing. So somebody could tell right away, oh, this person maybe did something wrong, maybe went through some issue, we don't care, it doesn't matter. But now all of a sudden, look at this. All of the trusted interactions they're having are with people that do a lot of trustable, good, charitable, honest work. And this is a good person trying to rebuild a strong, trustful container. So this, along with a lot of other results of using the system, are things that were emerging in my mind for these 15 years until technology has come along to really put it together. And a lot of my thinking went off into, what will the wider repercussions of these things be? How will the rest of the environment be affected if somebody's in this frame of mind? If they can only interact this way, how will that create feelings of circularity and reciprocity within the community? If I'm antisocial, I don't want to deal with anybody, but I have a lot of selfish needs, okay, back in the disaster situation, the person who doesn't really want to interact, but also wants lunch, is motivated to join into community once they find out that the aid agency will deliver a whole truck full of beans, but they won't bring you your one bag of beans. well, you're instantly motivated to join in to the self-organized community, and they're able to deal one-on-one with the aid agencies and get a faster response. So that's kind of like the selfish drive towards pro-social behavior mode that's built into all sorts of this thing, you know. So as you're gathering, maybe by now, we're talking about some type of a phone app that is mostly contained on the phone. Obviously, a containerized version would allow people to feature phones to interact using just voicemail or sending photos. And the other benefit of having the containerized version is that it can interact all the time when people are on and offline, and they just check in and update and synchronize with that. But a bigger aspect is the phone-to-phone mesh networking component. That was like it's a primary feature, it's the primary mode of interaction, and it's the primary purpose. You know, the first two people coming out of a building need to be able to become the seed of a new community and branch out from there. And so overlays capture architecture also allows me to have these things coalesce. So I can be part of a smaller community that then joins in with a larger one as more people come out of the rubble. It can break apart and decompose pretty well. And then getting into other behavioral stuff with community, of course, the question comes up, how do you keep healthy community boundaries? How to keep people, you know, engaged and involved? How do you deal with governance in a community? And there's a lot of things that I choose not to deal with. And I'm trying to be the outer shell container and allow people to operate. But the way I've done communities is that it's very simple infrastructure using a thing called small web, which builds itself automatically and decomposes automatically. It's really beautiful. And having a community structure as a bounding circle or a bubble, I figured that the simplest method to ensure that things are breaking down into manageable chunks and keeping it human friendly and growing at a community healthy rate, not getting overwhelming or empty, driving people away, is to use kind of a couple of mechanisms. One is that we know Euler's number has traditionally been used to describe growth in the finance world. Is, a certain amount of growth is healthy and a certain amount of not quite growing isn't quite healthy. But there is sort of a strange universal constant about the development of growth of life energy. We're not sure how or why, but there it is. And so my experience in Discord and in BBSs back in the late 80s on through, I mean, I've been, my head, not quite as far as programming, but my head has been really, looking around, watching all the technologies emerge. And through the entire time, I feel like the primary means by which I dealt with situations and information coming in was by volume of, how much am I able to deal with this amount in this particular topic. And so I use traffic as the tool for judging how community gets structured. And by that, I mean, I left the spigot on full blast. If you're in a community, you get all of it or none of it. And I figured that at some point, very quickly, when noise becomes too great, then people would want to create subgroups. And since small web is so easy and cool, and I just use a fractal pattern, so anybody can subgroup for any particular reason, and they're all within the shell of the wider group. So I figured people would subgroup by the noise level that they were interested to have, and or subgroup into areas of interest. But instead of allowing people to adjust the noise level, they'd have to create a different group to adjust the noise level and become more comfortable. And I figured that would create structure out of their personal preferences, but make the whole thing obvious and keep it more fluid and alive. I also have indicators when community is getting unhealthy, when too much business is going on for the size of the space and the number of people, all according to Euler's number. So that's just an indicator. Doesn't control or change anything. Same thing with my trust indicators. I don't change anything because in disaster, you don't really care what their history is because they got a bucket of water and that's what you need. So trust, and even all the AI influence and the matching, all of that, I didn't realize how important it was, but I figured that the advantage of having AI help match stuff was that you'd be given a list of things to choose from, because humans really love choosing. And I wanted to use that drive to help drive interest in using the tool. So I figured, showing people a really highly relevant few options that they could pick from would be good for them in terms of feeling like you found something, but also really good for the system, because now when you have a value exchange with two things that are described, all of a sudden you've got a synonym in an ontology, and an ontology that's localized to you and the people around you and evolves and grows and changes as the system is getting used. And my ontology, being growing and changing and adaptive, can be shared with other people nearby to help the process of matching and sorting. But it also gives us a lot of understanding about what's happening in each particular place. And we can see the cultural drift and linguistic boundaries. And I get all that richness because I'm not defining anything. I'm just letting people do what they do, and sort of a blank canvas, but it's not going to be blank for long because people interact. And that's just what we do. So you can see now I'm starting to evolve these systems. I've got a system of verified chains that bounce back and forth and figure out who's valid. And I've got a system for ontology that grows and lives and develops and needs, but in the course of updating itself, it's self-pruning, right? So more relevant stuff, because it's all based on the matches, more relevant stuff pops up, less relevant stuff kind of fades away, unless you're searching for that particular term. I mean, I want a carpenter who is really old, who interned at a certain, place with somebody, likes to work with certain materials, and only has 1 or 2 repeat customers, but a lot of brand new kind of wild construction. So I can tune what I'm searching for in terms of creating and crafting a different kind of a need. So everything that I would want to do as a human interacting with other people, if I can see the parts of their chain that they want to expose, and those parts coincide with something that I ask for, then we're all benefited and we all get to move forward and be, more comfortable in life. And that's the sort of like daily driver part of this thing. Beyond disaster, connecting one individual's data points to a nonprofit, you can see the seamless transition into getting everything else that I need and want. And even aspirational stuff, if I want training, that's a need that I might have. And I can put that out. It doesn't exist yet. And there's lots of other people that skill who might be retired or bored and have offered that skill. And you can see the immediate cross-pollination. And I'm not concerned about things bumping into each other, because when you need an ambulance, that's a direct line from your need of an ambulance to the ambulance. There is no bunch of stuff you got to bounce through. There's no other search results. There's no other thing going on. It is an ambulance, and that's what you asked for. And that's directly what you get in the database. In addition to that, now I've got AI doing the matching thing. So we got a matching engine, we got the chains, and we got the ontology part. And those are my 3 pieces. And when the AI kicked back this triplet, each one of these systems worked perfectly with that triplet. Okay, so I've got statefulness, I've got context. I can create a database that is human readable, and an AI can walk up to and instantly know context, instantly know the synonyms and the ontology, and not have to guess or infer. So I've taken 40, 60% of the processing need out of the picture in terms of AI matching and some machine language understanding of any particular moment. And then, because this is all an individual sovereign being, and they can create a seed of a community wherever they happen to be on Earth, it's infinitely scalable. We're not competing with some overarching infrastructure. I'm not sending a 10 gigabyte ledger file around. So there's a whole lot of repercussions that come out of this. And I'll just start briefly with governance. If you're a body of people and you can put forth a need that's on chain, so it's immutable, can't be erased and can't disappear, then as long as that need exists and it hasn't been met by governance, who's accepted responsibility for it, if they did, but we'll assume that you asked for something that the government does, and government said, yep, that's what we do, and we're going to put it in our bucket of things to do. The longer that thing stays undone, well, it should be really simple for public servants to have to display a badge showing exactly how many things that they've done or what percentage is left undone. So now we know exactly the performance rate of every individual who's accepting responsibility for requests. We know whether they've offered something and delivered on it, because we asked and we kept a record of our asking. It doesn't require government approval, it doesn't require legislation, doesn't require any rule structure by any entity anywhere on the planet. It's just us saying, that's what I want, and you didn't do it yet. Pretty simple, and that straightforward, and that powerful. And I think what happens in that environment it's just like having a bunch of people, better than having a bunch of people on TikTok, because this is a verifiable individual. Zero trust, so nobody needs to know my address, but you can verifiably tell that I live in your district, I'm a human being, and there's only one of me, and this is what I want. And that, I think, is giving us the ability to cause influence change. At election time, if you see 5 people with big red dots, you know who you're going to vote for. And the next time somebody comes in, they're going to be a checklist doer, not an hyperbole machine, right? So we're rewarding the behavior we're looking for by presenting accountability, but it's a very simple statistic. There's nothing unusual about it. And a public servant being tracked like that, they shouldn't have any issue with, because they're tracked in all these other official government mechanisms. We can even use that data to gauge our thing, but it's not quite the same as needs. So at some point pretty soon, we're seeing that inflection point. Governance needs and wants data to keep the people happy, and they can go find it through various means that don't actually really work, or they can use this source, and the price they pay for this source, because it's pristine and golden, the only price they pay is not being able to own it. They have to ask permission for it, but they get all of it. They get more than what they could possibly want, specifically what they want, formatted in a way that works with all of their systems, geolocated, current, timely, and updated voluntarily by the source, because they want what they want. No ambiguity, no mistakes. And the exact same type of a thing that works for community infrastructure and the sub-community would work for any organizational chart. So that's the kind of the value add. So if I can talk about implementation and how we get this out into the world if you want, or if you have any questions, I can talk some more, but I'm feeling like I don't want to go on a spiel and put you to sleep.
I am far from asleep. This is I find this to be extremely valuable. I really appreciate the mesh that you've created here of different ideas. It's been a long time people trying to work with like mutual verification and create propriety with that, right? And it comes down to context. You know, you got to get context into the system, or else even if you claim propriety, people can't make sense of it. So I'm loving just how it's the combination of things. I can see how you're saying, like, you really do need to have kind of an oh shit moment here, because you're trying to bring so many things together that individually can abstractly say, hey, this is an impactful thing. ZK proofs, obviously, you can just look at the idea behind them and say, wow, that's extremely impactful. But getting the impact from it, it's the difference between utility and usefulness, right?
Exactly.
There's not really a lot of useful ZK proof out there. It's a great utility to have. It's a potentiality, but I can't use it. So
the digital ID,
Yeah, it did. So I was going to bring that up too. Yeah.
Exactly. And I saw that flaw a long, long time ago too. I was like, we need something to do with it. Humans need a purpose to it. And if there's a way for them to easily interact and group together and have full communications amongst each other as a group that they choose, then they don't really need Facebook anymore, right? And I really resented what Facebook was doing to people, let alone all the stuff they do with the data around Cambridge Analytica and the fucking shit show our world has turned into because of that. There's also, when you talk about a comprehensive tool, like, we have to deal with reality too. I mean, people want to interact on social media, which is fine. As your own personal receipt chain, you should be allowed to keep and maintain and store all of your outputs, and then allow Facebook through API to have access to that store, as long as you want to let them have it. But if you want to cut that cord and keep your own stuff for yourself, or go port it over to somewhere else, that should be your choice entirely. So that is bringing me to the API approach, because there's a couple of things I needed to have in order to have these chains be trusted, right? So if a value exchange involves monetary exchange, or something involved with a bank account, or even there's lots of these like Kraken, you can get a fiat plus crypto accounts, and that'll just continue in the future, like whatever. So, but in the exchange, if you're going to say that there's some sort of monetary involvement, I figured that it wouldn't be too hard to allow the institution to do the writing so that and they certify that they did it, so there's no ambiguity at all, and it's all like legally binding for better of a lack of a better term. That each party should have some transparent pass through to write to the chain just for that purpose. It doesn't matter what they write, because that's the space that's allotted to them, and only that space is allowed for outside engagement, whatever it might be. And as I was looking at ways to do that, it came up, or the AI let me know, that sort of the trend in APIs is to compose them along the way, to have discoverable APIs. You kind of point in a particular direction, and then all the API capabilities and resources are discovered and then built up on the fly. So that's my approach within Has Needs. That it's a single system to build APIs on the fly. And that same system builds APIs for you to interact with your bank, as to allow Facebook to have access to your spleen for the next hour, or whatever. And that same thing happens in terms of sharing personal information. So this is what we get back to: the naked guy, gal in a disaster trying to interact with the NGO who doesn't know where anybody else is. And normally these guys are paying like a team of PhDs, full salaries, to guess, basically, to do statistics and try and figure out, which shipment needs to go where. And it's very expensive for them, and it's very expensive for the victims, the survivors. They need different interaction. So this individual is able to say, hey, yes, this is me. I'm at this location and I need this, this, and this. But the value exchange then comes into it. And how do we guarantee that he knows that they're going to get something, and they know that they're going to get the data they're looking for, that it's accurate? So in that value exchange is the exchange for the data for the services that they're promising. And each has their own standard, contract, whatever that they utilize. But point being that exchange was entirely opinions, right? That was that guy's opinion about what he needs in that moment, but it's vital information for the NGOs. That concept, and this is kind of my thinking went through it. So, okay, now if I'm sharing personal information with one entity and gaining some value from it, now basically this whole thing is more or less a personal opinion market space, right? You're just doing direct marketing. And I used to work in IBM at a section called Data Power. It's a middleware product, and it converts XML really fast. And essentially it is the piece of hardware, now virtualized, that is doing all the shuttling of people's private data back and forth. That's just ambiguated by a code number. But these are the devices being used to build up all these profiles on people and attack you in a marketing sense before you even show up at the website. It sees you coming and just starts building up on something they're going to nail you with. And it was kind of horrific, honestly, to recognize the scope and scale of this industry. It's really huge, all the different facets of the extractive economy. And to put a whole nother 5 billion people through the course of experiencing Western commercial advancement through the internet was kind of horrific too. So one interesting and I think really elegant part of this is that everything that markets do with consumers and vendors is recreated more simply with Has Needs, and it advances it forward into another realm where you can advertise your social follows, you can advertise things that you care about and like, and you can respond to incentives by different vendors for whatever purpose, because if they're able to get a hold of you reliably and directly, then there's a few $100 billion slush fund all of a sudden from all these middle level marketers that aren't necessary anymore. And every commercial environment has these people. So the efficiency gains of interacting directly will completely change how people choose to share goods. And history shows us that it's not necessary to give your name, address, and shoe size to somebody because you want to take a look at their products, right? It's just totally, the bizarre system is totally normal. People put their stuff out and they basically advertise it well. They give a good description of what they've got. And if that's something that matches what you need and want, then now you can do business. That's a respectful, honorable, it's as old as people, and this thing of being marketed and having your tonsils ripped out before you say hello is new, and it's cancerous. And I don't think it's healthy for society. And so I'm really proud that Has Needs is able to eliminate that whole extractive, parasitic economy, more or less. And this all happens with this data triplet that pulls these systems together into one functional form. Excuse me. So we've covered disaster, politics, and commerce, right?
Yeah, that's I really appreciate what you just described in terms of like I struggle to share a message with people that I deal with a lot of the times, which is usually I share it in the form of like money as a birthright,
Mm,
a sovereign right, and they say, "What? Is that a sense of entitlement, or everybody should like? Is this communism? What are you talking about?"
mm,
And I'm like, "No, it's that we have something we call money, and it's not really money. It doesn't do what we need to have done by it." And
right.
that's what you've expressed with the market, and it's a like you say, it's a recent phenomenon. People have been dealing with each other for ages, since the first cavemen knocked a couple rocks together and said, "Wow, that's cool." This it's been there's something has come between us and that birthright,
Yeah. Yeah.
that access to expressing ourselves. And we mentioned mutual verification earlier. um, Add a little bit of complexity with like settlement,
Mhm,
and figure out what you mean by that.
mhm.
But that's what markets are. A price is a mutual verification of value.
Yeah.
And just getting all that stuff to add up and get back to it, right? So, and then when I look at it like that, I say, okay, so this is serving, kind of the promise of Web3 and crypto when we needed protection from the systems that it had identified and said, we're going to make something that doesn't where you don't have to interact with that system. Like the best protection here is to ostracize the system itself. Don't participate in it.
Yeah.
But if it's the only way to make a paycheck, then what do? Well, maybe you need a new system, or you need to, or honestly, reconnect with the old, right? Get back to being human again.
Well, I don't
And
exclude banks. I just don't compete with them.
sure,
And that's on purpose because they tend to kill people that compete.
yeah,
So, like by coming at it from disaster, that's really kind of my killer app in a way. Because in disaster, and I've watched this over and over all over the world. A little bit of history. Okay, so from 2010 Haiti earthquake, I got deeply involved in crisis mapping, which is gathering messages from the world and putting it onto a map that the ground responders are using to interact with the local situation. Okay, so the idea is you get a lot of around circuitous. They call a neighbor, they call a relative, they call a friend who puts it on Facebook, and now we get the message. And there's examples enough of that people thought, oh, we got to gather all this stuff and put it on a map, and it was really useful. Haiti particularly, but that was because we had a P3, the Navy plane came, did low-level surveillance, and we got pristine, beautiful imagery, and a whole shit ton of people really quickly were able to determine where's a roof broken. So we got some really good maps, where's the bridge out and whatnot. That hasn't happened since. So all the rest of the crisis mapping for the following 4 years, basically, I was going to school. So I had lots and lots of time that I was devoting to crisis mapping, like nonstop. And that was a really tumultuous time period. We had floods, hurricanes, typhoons, giant landslides. We had the whole Arab Spring thing, all the revolutions. I got an award from Obama for the Libya work. But it was a really dynamic and exciting time, but we got to see how different emergency services responded to their catastrophes. The Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand was another example, earthquakes in Nepal. So it was a really unique opportunity to see, how people interact and what the societal response is to different situations. And over, these were, I saw Western trained systems with Western trained experts who come in from on high with a box of stuff and then disappear a couple of weeks later. And you never heard from, the situation again. So there's no follow through, there's no maintenance. And the people who were there were left to the systems that they had before the aid showed up. Okay. So like whatever systems were in place didn't change, and how humans behaved didn't really change despite the savior coming in with a helicopter. So I decided really early on to just avoid everything that they do, everything that they deal with, because it wasn't coming. So I just went back to that granular spot. Who's my atom in this atomic structure? And that's a sovereign being. And that way of thinking really came to me when I was 16. I read Bucky Fuller's The Critical Path, and that was his life path, basically. He was on the verge of committing suicide when he basically recognized that as a survival organism, human beings are unparalleled. And if there's something in his surroundings that was causing him to want to self-destruct, then he had to ignore all of it in order to find out what's essential in life. And his geometry, he's credited with the geodesic dome, but that all came about because he was watching the sea foam on the shore in Maine. And the nature's got no concern whatsoever about pi or trigonometry. It just is trying to do the most stuff with the least effort. And that comes back to packing of spheres. So all of his geometry is built off of how spheres pack together. So these ways of thinking, these systems, and trying to just go back to the base unit. What do we actually really essentially need as a being? And then from there, build everything out. How would I want to interact? And then bring in my experiences through different various types of emergencies and my own trauma, to try and say, these are the guardrails, these are the ways that this has to work, and this is the way it can't work, and this is what people need, and how to make people's needs beneficial to everybody else. Because after all, even if your community is FEMA, it's made up of sovereign individuals who have their own needs and resources within that environment. So this system is uniquely able to capture the needs of them in their office space, as well as individuals in that moment, and respond to all different levels of their being, in a way that it doesn't distract or cause you to have to worry about what you've forgotten, because it's all right there in front of you. This community has these messages about this thing that you're working on. It's all very rational in terms of how humans work. And because it's in our phone, it's in our devices, the location is ubiquitous. And I use homomorphic encryption to allow relevance attachment without divulging information. And then if you join in a community, then the community becomes your location abstraction. So there's safety mechanisms in how you interact in a system that still represents and recognizes you've got a working life and a physical home life, and that both deserve different kinds of interactions. And in terms of community governance, I wanted to stay all the way out of that one. I figured that if the infrastructure was simple enough and effective, then you wouldn't really need governance as such. That people could subdivide into working groups, but you wouldn't need one working group to be telling another one what to do. And that's something I always felt, but I really have had it reinforced a lot through reading some amazing work on the actual archaeological history. One book called The Dawn of Everything, by, who is that? Wengrow and Graeber, I think it is. But it basically chronicles the actual archaeological findings as best we know it at this point in time, and busts a bunch of mythology and really puts things clearly in front of you. And one predominantly a strong theme through all the indigenous archaeology is a basic life way, which involves one rule, which is don't tell anyone else what to do. And in a system that can respect that for everybody, then you've got something to work with. With that as a premise, then you can build out in a lot of different directions and still have a healthy system. So not allowing anyone else to impinge on your sovereignty, or selectively allowing, but in exchange for value, is something that's sustainable, in my opinion. You can still work with that. And then the question becomes, even if you have nothing, how do you get the information that someone else is willing to pay for? And I haven't seen any other system that can quantify it in that way without trying to turn everybody into dollars first. And that to me is a critical flaw. Because as you mentioned, in the systems that were used for exchange have now become what it's all about. And I would kind of characterize that as saying that money was useful for a while, but now money has become the worship idol, literally. And by worshiping the money instead of what its function is the point at which we started to go bad. And I think that was sort of like, along with the people that control it, the creation of banks would probably be, to me, the sort of foundation of that. We've got this coffer of it, and we say what it's worth, and we say what each of you are worth because of that. And at that point, you've got a breakdown. So anything based on fiat currency in any way, shape, or form that involves or pretends to care for humans or support human systems, it can't possibly work, because it's a car with square wheels.
I just had to dig into my reading stack here, and I do have Dawn of Everything.
Read it twice. It's
Yeah.
especially that part where they start talking about Kondiaronk, talking about the early colonial experience of the first settlers that came over here, the first few dozen years. And as more and more people came over, enriched with their own Enlightenment thinking, the Jesuits particularly, they're highly intellectual, spent all their time studying, capable of learning new languages, so they could speak fluently in these languages as they tried to intellectually convert. They discovered very quickly that all of the natives they came across were eloquent, thoughtful, deliberate, and careful thinkers. And that's a result of their culture. It wasn't some genetic anomaly. And as these people got into deeper and deeper conversations, we saw people that were God-based, which is paternalistic, were in competition with a king, another, dominating paternalistic theme. It's clear that European history felt that was the normal state of things. They'd either felt it always or had it beaten into them one way or the other. That was what they were arguing, the benefits of having some overlord. And it was very easy to point to the hypocrisy of people who called themselves free, post or leading up to the American Revolution, called themselves free, but they actually were subservient. And that hypocrisy was pointed out and discussed at length in such a way that Kondiaronk was shipped back over to Europe to literally debate with people in France and England. He kind of toured. And I'm talking with the greatest thinkers at the time. And the result of the changes from those conversations years and years and years later influenced the French Revolution. So it's a really easy history to trace once you know the names involved. And the names are all there. You can, pretty easy to look up too. They've just sort of been in the periphery, but not really linked together in a way that put sense to it. But it's very clear the transition of ideas and what eventually came back as the American Revolution. And you can also see it in the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution is almost word for word ripped off from the confederacies in the local area, the Seneca and the nearby tribes. So their plagiarism was incomplete. They took a few of the parts that served them at the moment, but they forgot the most important parts, which are about culture and belonging and sovereignty. And so,
and you could argue that that's still that's in the DNA of our culture, absolutely. And that they almost sort of LARPed as deeply connected, and deeply and intuitively. I'll go off the deep end if I keep going that way, but and that DNA is still present. We struggle with things like judicial supremacy. Why? Because we never did quite, shuffle off the coil of, like you say, paternalism and an overlord, and somebody is the interpreter. Somebody is the last word on what is true, what is valuable, and so we struggle with it to this day.
It gives me a lot of hope, actually, because it sort of brings me to my I guess the last part of the whole product, which in some ways is the most important part. And I didn't do this on purpose, but like I said earlier, like a lot of aspects of this were produced in chunks to create an output that you might not have been able to tell from the chunks. I call it emergent design. I'm trying to create pro-social reactions and behaviors that help the whole, but without actually explicitly saying it. But I kind of put you in that mode. And if you want to get what you want, then you have to join the group, because that's going to get you what you want faster. So that's the best way to do it for everybody. And at the very second you break your own shell to get engaged, then things can begin to flow. The real problem with trauma is isolation. And as long as you can keep that barrier closed, nothing can get in and nothing can start to warm up and loosen things up. So every interaction that you have, that first one is actually, from 0 to 1 is a larger jump than from the 2, 3, 4. And it just gets easier as you feel better and have more fun interacting. So there's a lot of this kind of thought went into it. Years before any of this, I worked on a product that I designed. It was a folding sail to use with inline skates for sailing with. And because most shorelines, built in a certain way where the winds are going one way, you would want to fold it up and then skate back and then do it again. Basically sort of how things work out in land. It's very rare you got a wind you can use both ways. at any rate, so that was a reason for folding it up, and I made some paths to go along with it, stuff like that. But I also was very involved with environmental and social justice activism. I was an activist trainer, and I have always had a strong desire to provide environmental education in a way that was that would stick and be useful. And that, for me, always revolved around fun. You know, I saw more people learn more and get more immediate visceral sensation from having fun. When nature, the forces of nature pushing you around, it's kind of universal. Everybody's got that little bit of wonder and amazement. And with a handheld sail, it's even more, because you're just capturing it right in front of you. It's like there, and it's a pretty cool feeling. And I was really trying to promote this product as a sport, you know, like a new sport kind of a thing, because inline skating, it just kind of started up. You know, it was really blowing up, and there was this feeling kind of like Silicon Valley, I guess, where if you just had an idea, you could get some bucks and start things up. So I got all jazzed, and I had some high hopes. But a big element of it was the idea that I could take all this satellite imagery and maybe drape it onto a globe and show people, you know, mostly in flat places, you know, where it would be fun to skate that day, make it easier for them to enjoy the sport and get that feeling. And once they have that feeling, they would respect the earth more, just because they're now in contact with it. And it'd be that much easier to show them which parts of the map they can't skate on today, because that's a coal plant and that plume is going this way in the wind and you don't want to go there today. And I figured that sensation of not being allowed to have fun would motivate them to go do something about that coal plant. So I talked to a guy named Elon Crew at NASA and said, "Hey, what do you think about this idea? Let's do this thing. What do you think?" And I didn't hear much else. And then a few years later, about 1996, 97, this thing called Whirlwind popped up. NASA's got an open source project where it has a globe and they drop satellite imagery on it. I was pretty excited. So I was all jazzed about making plugins for that would ingest any kind of data, portray it on the map, and let you build up a view of something that helped you in your own life, that you're interested in, that you want to explore and see. So I was looking for the most agnostic way to show wind data, wind speed, overlay of maps of roads where it'd be fun to do that thing and cross, you know, reference them so you know where you can have a good time, and add on the pollution layer. So I figured I needed something that could show these different layers of data. And I was kind of working along those lines of using maps with your own stuff for useful purposes. I was building prototypes in 2005, where I had a module for Whirlwind that you could ingest a CSV file. For instance, I got from the United Nations. UN MDG had a program for a while. They're inviting projects, you know, people to submit stuff that'd be kind of fun and interesting, how they could promote the Millennium Development Goals. So I came up with this thing, and they can drop in a CSV file, and it would stack and show you the data for whatever that thing. But you knew what it was, right? So you didn't need to have some special interface built, because you know what you put in there. Oh, this is the vaccination data. Here they are, the past 10 years stacked up, and I can see that they had poor numbers, and then they got better, because now it's green at the top and red at the bottom. And here's Cameroon, they had a war, so it was green, then bright red, and then green again. And here's Nigeria, and they were like faltering, but then they're bright green. So at any point, I figured that I could drop in a gross national product map, and then I would be able to pair which company's program was relevant to the other one and say, hey, whose lessons learned? You're still orange and you're bright green for the past 5 years. Maybe there's something we can learn from each other. And I was going to try and find, you know, the emergent information and knowledge gathering out of it at some point. But my own life got kind of disrupted. And I was working for a nonprofit at the time where we would take precision GPS coordinates on clear cuts in the wilderness in Idaho. And clear cutters are not particularly tidy and not particularly accurate. So they very frequently cut over the line. And anytime they cut over the line, then we got to petition we got to basically have that clear cut license revoked. And that land was now permanently part of the Wilderness Act. And they're still doing it, saving millions of acres a year. It's really cool. Of course, obviously, you know, lumberjacks are getting more accurate. But all this is to say that by the time Haiti happened, I'd already been deeply engaged in GIS and globes for exchanging and sharing information. So that's always been with me, and it just became more powerful over the years because it's a language agnostic platform. Everybody and every species has their own internal mental map built up in time. So this would resonate and harmonize with that. And I also know that just through subsequent trauma research, it's super important and helpful to be able to see your supportive networks out in front of you to show that they actually do exist and help spark memories of where you have those interactions, which brings back floods of emotions and energies and hormones that help you feel positive about your own situation, regardless of what it is. Because everybody's interacting, so everybody's building up a map of interactions. So just having a place, sort of, I belong here. And that's what Map Kibera was all about, if you're familiar with that project. But that basically was an unmapped place, but is the largest slum in Kenya, and it became mapped, and it was a big deal because people started feeling like they exist and they had to be dealt with, and the government had to deal with them because now they're on the map. So I took that another step, and the value of personal mapping has been kept away from us because Google's the one doing it. Google's deciding what's important to show you. And yeah, I'm searching, but it's not anything, it's not you, right? And the only way to really map yourself is to have full access and be sure that no one else has access. And once I'm in that spot as a sovereign being, I can map all my own data. And if I want to, I can share my stream with you. I can put a phone in the field and have it monetize my stream of temperature and barometer readings and rainfall, and maybe even what it looks like for the land. So you can see if it's frosty this morning. I could stream that out to everyone in a local area in places like Madagascar where they have no National Weather Service. Where the local farmer doesn't really care or know about satellite imagery and can't read isobars, but he knows what his field looks like. And if he can share that with his friends for free, or they give him some of their crop, who's to say what that is? So that was another reason I kept banks completely out of it. And the data structure is involving a globe as a universal interface, but it's kind of zoomed in to your local territory, whatever you can get to. Obviously, if you have an airplane, then your zoom is 500 miles, but if you're walking, it's like 20 miles. But the point was to use a graphical interaction that helps orient us in our real regular life. And that's totally not within the realm of awareness of 99% of the coders on the internet today, because they were born and raised in a printed page paradigm. And they've only ever seen the printed page paradigm. And going virtual is just kind of like, a fun, gidgety thing, but it's not really for purpose. And the opposite is true for somebody who's raising cassava on a hill in Tanzania. They care very much about the local conditions. They care very much about precipitation tomorrow. They just don't have access to that data, and no real, maybe a few NGOs come through and give some crop information, but it's usually a Western company selling their own solution that they got some funds for, and they're giving it to you for free, and they hope to sell it to all your neighbors. There are no systems built for people right now. So by focusing on the individual, I can't deal with banks, but banks have to be accommodated, right? So I made that pass through so banks can write, and I call myself a receipt, and nobody has a problem with receipts. And that also lets me off the hook for arbitration and mediation. I don't get into any of that. It has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. If anybody else wants to argue whatever, and when you're done arguing, then write it down. And if you write it down and have to reverse it, that shows you as somebody who's not being very careful, and that's going to get you tuned out of a lot of conversations. Until disaster happens, at which point everybody's going to turn down the security settings and get everything they can possibly get.
Yeah, that's, and you mentioned that earlier with the disaster settings, like the concept of essentiality. Emergence, a ton of sudden emergence, obviously emergency.
Yeah.
It strips away everything but the most relevant thing, right down to naked and alone, I gotta survive, right? It strips away all the irrelevant stuff, you could argue, to being alive. Just being, ultimately a sovereign being is just a living being. So it makes so much sense that like the use case catalyzes in that frame of reference, right? It's easier to think about. Obviously, you've got your experience, like in a way, you're the right guy to build it, right? But anybody in an emergency is a potential user.
Launch. Okay, you want to hear about the deployment? I think I started to get on that a little bit earlier.
Go ahead.
All right. The reason I started railing on a moment ago about all the different emergency systems I've been involved with is because I discovered that at the county level in disaster, all bets are off. And if you have a system that provides what they need in that moment, then you win in that moment. And
absolutely,
Some years it's a tornado and it's FEMA and they're watching Facebook. Another year, it was a couple of girls in Massachusetts where the tornado came through and they made a little help me out app that got big for a while. Other places it's 311. Other places it's neighbors.com or what have you. So over and over and over again, I saw that disaster was a place of flux where everything's going on and all people want are a few basic things. And I specifically and deliberately built those things into has needs in terms of benefits for the emergency manager and the county structure. What's beautiful about county is that they're accountable to the local population. You know, state agencies, they can fuck around, they can make mistakes. It's not a big deal. At the county level, they're very vulnerable to being voted out. They have to be responsive to their population, and they carry considerable weight in terms of emergency planning and budgetary stuff, and they get direct money from the state who gets it directly from federal. So they're the perfect location to come into town and set up something for them to use. Counties across the country right now are spending at least $1 million and maybe up into 10 or 20 million for LA County, but they're spending millions of dollars in data collection, harmonizing it, converting it, geographically referencing it, and putting it in databases and pivot tables and finding some way to make use of all this data that they're getting because they want to predict what people need and want. You can see the tie-in here. So I come to a county level organization and say, we're going to install this thing for free. I will recreate your organizational chart with my community structure. It operates exactly the same, but actually easier and better because the communications are facilitated. And if there's a slowdown or a breakup or a message is overdue someplace, you know exactly where in the structure you've got a friction spot to pay attention to. So it's helpful in that way. By creating a conduit for citizen data to come in, I'm potentially getting rid of, usually $2 to $6 million out of their budget, which is pretty attractive for county level administrators. Plus, I'm giving them a picture of data that they could never buy. I mean, the emergency manager is really excited to find out exactly who lives where and what their issues are, and they're giving it to you freely. It's georeferenced, it's clean, it's updated, and it's brand new. They just don't own it, but it's there and visible, and he always knows he can rely on that data. That's a whole different paradigm for everybody in the county level. And then my price, what I asked them for, after giving them the value of this data, is I want 5% of realized gains. So compared to the last tornado you had, however much you spent last time, how much you saved on using has needs, give me 5% of the difference. And in most of the situations, because I know how their communications go, we're talking about $2 to $50 million per event. Now, it's going to take a while for them to do the math and accounting and tell you your overall price, but I'm giving them data to make that more accurate also, right? And they have that process ongoing. And the next question, people say, well, how do you get people to use it? But then I go back to the value proposition. If you're a citizen and something's just happened and the government says, hey, you know what? Here's the way to interact with us. It's free. Your messages will always update you before anybody else. So you'll always have the latest data on what's happening with your message. Your message stays alive and you can see if we've responded to it. You get to collect and gather and help your friends out in a way that we can't see. And you can use this with social media. You can use this for your friend. You can use this any way that you want because it protects you. And in fact, if you really want to fuck everybody over, you can say that the only way anybody in the world can interact with me and get any of my personal data is to enter an agreement and a contract with me here on this chain of my own that tells me how long you're using it, what you're using, and I'm going to include self-destruct code in my smart contract. At that point, if your personal data is found anywhere at all without that token describing its purpose, use, and duration, that is illegal on its face because you've decided to enter into only these kinds of agreements. So you've decided that. It's not even an opt-in. You just say, hey, I never gave you authorization. Show me the token where I authorized you to use my data because I found the data on this server over here. So instead of attacking the owner of the data, you attack the server. That's what they did with kids stuff. Like you attack the server owners because they are very interested in getting rid of the bad guy and keeping their server clean. So I've got a social reinforcement mechanism in the real world, Web 2.0. And I was reminded by the AI that this actually is an embodiment of Web 3.5, which I'm kind of happy to inaugurate. I like that. That feels good to be able to say that this is that.
Yeah, yeah, especially given the, I wouldn't call it failure, but the aspirational layers of Web 3.
Let's just
Unless
call
you're,
it a start. You know, I mean, it's a good
yeah,
start.
just to start. Yeah. Yep.
So the data triplet fitting into all three functions, making each of these independent systems now work as one, was my big breakthrough. And as soon as that happened, I've been vibe coding these packages together. I'm involved with each of the organizations for a couple of years now, just passively and talking about what I want to do. But now I'm actually plugging it all together, and the packages are not complex, right? It's mature stuff. It's not experimental, and Windsurf can plug it all together. So I don't know what to say. Like, everything I thought would be hard is no longer hard. And in my whole life, that's only ever meant that I've now got resources to push harder and faster in the directions that I can, because the world can't wait for something like this, you know?
So what are you talking about in terms of having the resources?
Well, when we're talking about implementation timeline, it used to be 3 years, but now it's like 6 months. It used to be $4 or $5 million, but now we're down to $500,000, probably, if you hire some people. You know, like, having the thing was, okay, I said that the persona manager was a black box for a while. After I talked to NextGraph, the next thing I hear is now they're building a persona manager. So that's like another checkbox taken off my list.
Nice.
So, like, the world is folding into place for this to happen easier and easier, but I still don't see anybody looking at it off the printed page and from the human perspective. So I feel like it's just a matter of time before someone does, and then I got to scramble and argue about why my thing makes more sense than their thing.
Yeah, and you get around it all in some ways if you are just in the hands of end users to begin with.
Exactly. So my feeling is that I want to stealthily create something, get it to, I've got friends that are emergency managers in different states. We go through some exercises there, and I've got friends at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. They do an outdoor camp out every year, and that's coming up. So I wanted to get some prototypes, but basically I'm thinking the sooner I can get to a disaster and just jump in, even a small one, you know, just looking for a little disaster, but just jump in and say, hey, let's do this. Let's try it out. And if I save you some money, then we'll talk about price. But what I'm going to save them right off the bat is the biggest fear that anybody has in that moment. I've been in IMSOCs. I mean, I'm in dispatches. I know what I'm talking about. The biggest fear is getting cut off. And the biggest contributor to getting cut off is all these pesky civilians that keep calling back the helpline, trying to figure out what's going on because nobody's updating them. And the emergency managers only have one spigot. They only have one, they can only shout out the bullhorn. But if they could identify groups of people that were affected and give them accurate updates and give everybody else a generic update, that would instantly prolong their career by about 3 years. Instantly. They go through so much stress and worry trying to craft a message that's going to help people but not help others, not make people vulnerable. That's a whole job of its own, basically. And those decisions to release information or dispatch people certain places, that's all guesswork. And the worse the disaster is, the more chaotic the communications are and the less useful information is coming out of it. So you can understand the advantage of a system where you know exactly what you're getting from that one point source, and that's all you get. So the system stays whole and the system stays complete, and we don't get the typical breakdowns that happen at the 11th hour when you need it the most, right? That's when the systems break down. And I avoid that. So just that process alone, just avoiding breakdowns, that can be quantifiable. There's an accountant's bill for sending out the emergency crew. There's an accountant's bill for the administrator who had to reboot the servers, you know? So that's a quantifiable number. And if they don't have to do that, that's a sizable number. And 5% of that is totally adequate to keep this thing survivable.
Excellent.
And nobody minds, right? I'm saving money. I'm taking 5% of what I already saved you. And because that's 5%, it's a sliding scale. My guy in Zimbabwe pays nothing. You know, the first time hurricane in Brussels, they're devastated. They didn't have a hurricane before. Well, then they just had one. So the comparing it to last time can't happen. So this is zero for them. And
Yeah.
it's not about making money really, but it's about being able to sustain and go pay for the places that can't do it. And, I would probably have to build some infrastructure, probably some S3 buckets where people can store their containerized version. But the goal really is for that county level to provide all the infrastructure, even though they can't see it or control it. But they provide the infrastructure because what they get out of it in the end is so worthwhile. They just say, hey, yeah, here, take a little bit of server space because we're getting actionable data, and they get to fire a whole chunk of people that are not doing much good.
Right. Yeah. And then that folds into what you were saying with holding political entities accountable, political institutions accountable, for better or worse. Emergency response is a political institution.
Oh, no doubt about it. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, and
in the
larger scale, right? When we start to look at which departments, which counties get the brand new fire truck, which places get that 2 extra PSI water pressure in the hydrants.
Right. Right.
There is a lot of disparity socially from one place to the next. So being able to map that is the beginning of addressing it. You have to know where it exists. And if the government's controlling those maps, we're not going to see all that data ever.
And on the other side of it, talking about establishing conditions, you've got users who are slowly upskilling and increasing their capacity in emergencies.
Yeah.
Especially, if you start talking about places like Tornado Alley, where they get lots of experience with it, right?
Yeah.
And eventually, they're more reliant on using their network of verified connections than they are on state level response, and they become even more sovereign, so to speak.
Exactly
right?
Right.
They get a little bit of themselves back.
Exactly right. And the more they do that, the easier the job is for everybody in the NGO or in the county office, because they're not worried about 50 communities. They get this organized group giving them a to-do list.
Yeah,
right. In my inbox. It's a to-do list. And if I check that off, I get a bonus and they get what they want. And I trust them to tell me what they want.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Thanks for listening. I appreciate having the whole spiel. I'm glad it's recorded now because
yes,
it always gets me kind of emotional and excited. And I'm not sure I'm ever conveying it adequately, but I really appreciate having the time to pace it all out and put some history in there, because I think now you get it. Right. And a lot of people, when they first approach it, matching engine, what's the big deal? Who cares? Sovereignty. Well, I got a DID. I'm cool. To be able to really wrap it together and say, this isn't even about you. If you're on a computer right now, this isn't for you either, to a certain degree. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm really targeting the next 5 billion people who need to come online. And if somebody hasn't grown up around the internet in their periphery, they're just begging to be scammed left, right, and side.
They're just
manipulated, even just emotionally ripped off.
By not being here, they're vulnerable. By joining, they become even more vulnerable.
That's an important point. Yeah, and I feel like we owe it to them to avoid that entirely.
Yeah, and all of that human, I hesitate to call it capital, but all of that value is latent because of it. It's just not pushing. It's not helping everything move forward.
Exactly. And it's really interesting too. You call up this, human capital. We've only been taught terms that turn us into a commodity, right? We don't, when you think about a person, you can look at them like, hey, that's a ripe piece of fruit. There's lots of sweetness and great vitamins in there, but there is nothing really to help anybody tap into that necessarily. It's really interesting. And we've only been taught this one method of being. So
yeah, it's really about paradigm busting. Yeah.
That's why I also find this thing, the more I'm working on this and I see it just expands into the areas where people are going to have to happily adjust their thinking. So I've been trying to, instead of focusing it as a social media thing, I'm focusing at disaster. And that's it's not massive reach, there's not everybody's in disaster every day, but at the same time, it's the right way to grow, it seems.
Yeah.
In the course of doing it, if other people they're going to hear about it, you can download it and use it with your 2 friends right there, and Laura is turning into a huge deal. So there's a lot of people out there wanting some kind of side channel of infrastructure for whatever different reasons are. And the ham groups, they've always been big,
Yeah. For sure.
there is always a sort of thread, but they haven't had access to it. If you didn't have a ham license, how many people then would be out there screaming on the airwaves? So I've just enabled that. I've turned everybody into their own empowered being. And in so doing, created the conditions for them to self-heal and be their own guide through the traumatic experience and forcibly connect each other through their experiences and highlight that, show it to them.
That's amazing. So there's like 2 layers that I would still, this is not sure what the timing on the call is, but I'm thinking about the viewers of the recording now. But yeah.
Come on, fat lady, sing. What you got? Lay it on me. I'll do it.
So there's like 2 layers that I'd like to get into. And I think what I'd like to do is schedule either 1 or 2 more sessions to unpack it. And for this session, I'll sick Gemini on it. We'll get a good summary that we can share so that people have a couple layers of being introduced to it and getting into it. Because I think everybody will want to see the whole presentation. But it might take a little bit of connecting and relevance to get them there.
Yeah.
So they're, especially as far as immediate places to share it, which is just like right in Odin, because I'm sure that crew would really love to hear about this stuff. The 2 angles that I would love to go deeper on is to kind of go backwards a little bit and talk more about like a question that surfaced for me. And I thought, well, this is the guy to answer that for me is trauma at the root of all isolation? And that's a really broad kind of a thing. And obviously there's probably theories, Jungian and everything else about it. But in your experience, like that's what I would want to know. Like, what do you see there? And then also unpacking at the same time, like I can tell there's a lot of, for you, emotional gravity in that center of what can you serve, like as a trauma survivor, now what? Like, what can I do to live with the trauma? What can I do to live with the after effects? What can I do to create new conditions to evolve as a being and all that kind of stuff? And I would love to get into that a little bit.
The answers for both of those, I think, that trauma happens.
Yep.
Lots of different ways. It just occurs. Trauma would be a slightly larger change than we're adapted to or able to adapt to. Right. And you're like somebody, you can shove a grape in your mouth, no trauma. You shove a baseball bat in your mouth, lots of trauma. So the issue about trauma isn't so much that it causes isolation. I think the issue about trauma is whether or not isolation is the result. So that is to say that if you're in a social community that is extremely gregarious, okay, you live in Brazil and somebody dies, you are not alone. There's no part of your being that feels alone. You're literally surrounded in 360 degrees with loving empathy. There's just no way around it. And you see that occur in a lot of other societies where they are that way. And I think that understanding that trauma exists, the question then for dealing with isolation is, how long is that traumatic moment allowed to exist? Because the trauma, I would say, the traumatized person is the outlier in that moment. Even though if everybody's traumatized, that's fine. Let's just call it in a social fabric of health, the traumatized one is the outlier. They are alone. They're isolated. They're experiencing trauma when things around them aren't. Baseball bat in the mouth is traumatized, your ears are fine. So the difference between whether someone remains traumatized in isolation is how long they're allowed to be isolated after the event. As a paramedic, I was part of I started a critical incident stress debriefing team where we would go to events that were particularly big and debrief the responders and take them aside and go through this initial moment. There's debate about whether or not that's a healthy process to go through. I've experienced it in a few different ways. I think it's helpful just to have that connection and to not necessarily heal everything in that moment, but to make sure that you don't start building rocks in your wall. Once you start building up rocks, then everything becomes another excuse because you start to be comforted in that moment, even though you're traumatized. even though you're hurting in pain, that wall feels like a shield at first, and it turns into a huge burden later on. I think that's where the isolation comes to be. And so long as the people around you allow it to occur, you have time for a quick anecdote?
Absolutely.
Coalinga I-5 accident, 300 plus cars, 150 cars, about 317 injured, a bunch of people died. The guy I transported patient back to the hospital with, it was an insane, on its own, an insane call. Lady died 3 or 4 times, broken skull, whatnot. The whole day was a traumatizing event. And this one particular guy I was on the rescue team with, we were fairly close, weren't from that town, so we identified in that way too, and kind of hung out a little bit, not very much. But the following year and a half before he moved away, ended up dying, drove himself off a cliff in a dune buggy. But that following time period, we had this dialogue from across the room. Every time we saw each other, worked together or not, the first instant we saw each other was like, "You good? I'm good." Meaning, are you going to start talking about your shit? Are you ready to confront any of that stuff? I'm too scared to. I'm not about to. I'm holding my shield up. And in order to get through this next few days, we're going to agree with each other that holding that shield up is what's keeping us alive. It's a lie. It's a complete and total lie. I mean, the most important thing in that moment is to have things around you to open up and bring that open. In our Western society, being closed off, the puritanical thing, it's deep and wide. You're alone. You're a cowboy. You pulled yourself up by the bootstraps, whatnot. That lone cowboy mythology is deeply damaging. And so that dialogue that he and I had was perpetuating the trauma, perpetuating the isolation. And because I wouldn't talk to him, I was allowed to not talk to myself. No one was allowed to know, kind of a thing. I'm holding it up. I'm okay. You look at me. Am I holding up okay? Yeah, you're holding. Okay. We had this very, very toxic thing that was hurting both of us.
Mutual verification.
Right? We say this is truth. And somebody brought that up not too long ago. So what about delusion? Like, what if a whole village says that they got 10 tons of gold, and that's fine for them in isolation? They can do that. But the second another village bumps into them, then that all falls apart because they want some of that gold and it's not really there. So now you've got some disparity in the system and somebody's got to get excluded. And in this case, with my chains, I exclude both of them. So now they got to go hash it out. That's a thing for them to go deal with, but they're forced to deal with it in order to get back into the system in a good way, So those kind of mechanisms are sort of part of the system. And the reason that I talk about value exchange for everything, like as the way you interact, because that naked person has an opportunity at that moment to remain traumatized and isolated by that trauma and to stay feeling alone and let that moment and that memory shape the rest of their recovery. Or they would say to themselves, I need something. I need to get something. I want help. And in acting out, if the only way they can act out is to get something back in exchange, and it's that thing I need and that thing I got, and we're both valuable to each other, now you've got a different mentality, just like that. And you've already cracked the shell before it starts to accumulate. So to me, that's the answer to number one. Number two, now what? Now I've been survived. I've got my stuff. And now I want to go forward. Well, that's up to me. If if I'm cold, I can ask for a blanket or a leather jacket. And if the leather jacket helps me feel cool or helps me stay warm when I'm walking instead of laying down, or makes me feel better, then that's what I should be able to get. I should be able to ask for that leather jacket instead of receiving the blanket. And that process just goes on. It builds outward. As you feel more capable, the things you ask for change on their own. So by not defining it, I allow that seamless transition. And there's this kind of mythological software out there that UN and other agencies talk about. And it's the thing that allows a parallel but asynchronous recovery. And nothing else allows that, but has needs. It's exactly how it's built.
That's great. So I have maybe 10, I'm going to call them challenges to this. Not criticisms necessarily, but just areas.
No, I'm in that phase. Really, honestly, I'm in that phase. I need whatever biting. I don't want to go any further on my assumptions if any part of them are wrong. So bring it on. I'm really genuinely cool about that. So, and you can put them in the chat or send them to me or what have you. I'm very happy about that.
If possible, maybe I could send them to you just to prep you a little bit, and then we could do another one of these and work through them. I think that would be great.
My absolute pleasure.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we'll stick Gemini on it. And then I got just a couple comments here
Okay.
for
Cool.
post-recording
Thank
comments.
you, Jeremy, I really appreciate that.
If I can find my host tools here.
And thank you for pulling us together.
No problem. You know, it wasn't happening smoothly, but I just felt like need to hold this space because listening, you know, one of the roles we have as ODIN network people is we listen at the edges, and I was getting a vibe from it.
Well, I was trying to bring it. I have long respected what you guys are doing.